Hello?
Bob?
Yes.
Michael Vicchio, how are you doing?
Pretty good.
Was you expecting my call?
Yes.
Okay. Didn't want to interrupt anything that was going on. How you been doing?
Oh, pretty good. Hold on just a minute. I want to move a comfortable chair over near the telephone.
Okay.
All right.
So what I wanted to do, Bob, is to take maybe about 30 minutes, and I've got a list of questions that I wanted to walk down through, if that's all right with you.
Mm-hmm. That'll be fine.
And these are questions that we've been set up for this veteran history project. So some of them, I think most of them apply, but there may be a couple that maybe don't have quite the same pertinence with the security guard role there that you're in. But let me start just with the basic as to when you first joined the Army. I know you went to Aberdeen, but was that where you first entered the Army?
No. I was drafted in June of 1945.
Oh, I see.
Just out of high school.
So the war wasn't over yet, huh?
No. My birthday is in February, and I went to the draft board and asked for a deferment to finish the 12th grade.
Mm-hmm.
And they said that I was sent to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, just south of Chattanooga, and they gave me a pre-induction physical and mental test, and that was in April of 45. When I came home, they said that they would grant the deferment until I finished high school.
Mm-hmm.
And then around the 1st of June, they sent me a letter telling me on what date I was to leave for Fort Oglethorpe again to be inducted.
Oh.
So that arrived about a little before the time I graduated. And most of the boys in our class went, those of us that were 18, went to Oglethorpe together.
Oh, really? And how long were you there?
Well, we were there only for a few days when we got inducted.
Yeah.
I tell the kids a story about my being inducted into the Army. You have to take an oath.
Yeah.
Military oath. Anyway, they ran us through more tests and everything, and then they walked us over to this little white chapel, and the chaplain, he prayed over us, and then an officer got up at the podium, and he said, I'm going to, administer the military oath, and he said, I want you to raise your right hand and repeat after me. And then he said, and I don't care whether you raise your right hand or say a word. When you walk out that door, you're in the Army.
Any which way you want to look at it, huh?
Right. It mattered to him.
That's pretty good. Yeah, that's a straight shooter, they call it. So where did you end up going from there?
I went to what they called an IRTC, Infantry Replacement Training Center.
Huh.
And that was at Camp Wheeler, which was just outside Macon, Georgia.
And what date was this still in June?
Yes.
So at that time, I am assuming that you still had, at least in the back of your mind, that you might end up going to the Pacific.
Yes, because the war in Europe ended in May.
That's right.
And all of our training was for Japanese.
Uh-huh.
And they had a little Jap village that...
is that right?
That they assaulted, and after that was toward the end of your basic training.
Uh-huh.
When you went through the infiltration course.
Uh-huh.
And then the next few days, then you had to assault this Japanese village, and they had little, what we thought were Japanese-looking buildings.
Sure.
And so when I finished basic training, they were by that time they were looking for brains. So I had scored fairly high on this intelligence test that they gave us, and when we finished basic training, there was another boy from our battalion. He and I shipped out together to Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana.
Boy,
and
all over the place.
They trained us to be officer finance clerks because they were anticipating, a lot of officers being discharged.
Uh-huh.
So they sent me down to Camp Butner, North Carolina, to work in the finance office.
Now that's...
And after a month, I knew that wasn't for me. I enjoyed being, outdoors too much.
Yeah.
And so I went to them and asked how I could get transferred, and they said, well, there's no way you're going to be transferred out here. We need you. And somebody said, well, you can always re-enlist. And I mulled it over for a few days, and I went to them and told them I wanted discharged so that I could re-enlist in the Ordnance Department.
Huh, I'll be darned.
In high school ROTC, I'd been on the rifle team.
Uh-huh.
And I always liked firearms anyway, so I thought I'd get a chance to work with firearms. So I re-enlisted for 3 years in January of 46 to go to the Europe as part of the Ordnance Department. So when I got to Aberdeen, why they assigned me a job. I went to school, started to school as a parts clerk for the Ordnance Department. And
when was that?
That was January.
January.
And part of February.
Yeah.
And then they came around and I guess there was maybe 25 or 30 of us. They called in one day and told us about this project. They wanted us to volunteer for it. So since I was going to be a parts clerk instead of working on guns and things, well, I said, well, hell, I might as well. So
that's what Dick Skanke had said, that he was involved in some kind of inventory.
Yeah,
he didn't like that either.
No end job, no, dead end type job.
Yeah,
you really weren't interested in.
Yeah,
and I mean, the people with brains are the ones they wanted to keep books.
Exactly. Oh, I know it. Yeah.
So anyway, I guess maybe one or two declined, but not very many. And then we hung around together for a few days, and then they shipped us out to Los Alamos.
Did you go all on the same train?
Yes, we went out on a troop train.
Oh, did you?
And that's when I first met Cleary, was while we were hanging around together, not doing anything, waiting to be shipped out. And I was a PFC, and he was a PFC. So of that group, he and I were the ones that had the longest service. I don't know much about his previous service, but he mentioned one time that he'd been in Iceland.
Oh, I see, boy.
So it could have been he was in Iceland and then shipped back to the States, when the war ended in Europe.
Well, that's something, yeah. So is he, did the two of you stay pretty close while you were there?
Yeah, we stayed fairly close the whole time. The last time I saw him was in January of 49 when I was discharged. But he stayed at...
Of course, he went in, and he ended up going to Korea, right?
Yes.
That's where he was killed over there. Huh.
And we all shipped out at Los Alamos about the same time, toward the end of 1947. And then they assembled a group of us to go down to Camp Hood, Texas, to sort of open up the bomb dump down there.
Yeah, that's right.
And then we turned it over to another group, and it was called an Army Air Base. And I'll think of the name probably sometime during this conversation.
Okay.
But it's on the map. It's Gray Army Air Force Base.
Huh. But it was right next to Fort Hood?
Who it was named after, but they named it after we left.
Oh, I see. Let me ask you something. When, obviously when you were in the Army, this is before you went to Los Alamos, I'm talking about in 45, back in the time when you were envisioning that you might be over in the Pacific.
Yes, we were being trained as infantry replacement.
Right. Now, when you heard how did you first hear about the atomic bomb?
Well,
do you recall that?
No, but I can recall we were going. We were coming back we'd been out in the field for a few days, and we were coming back. And down there, we always walked like you see GIs walking, a column on each side of the road.
That's right, yeah.
And our arms were, sling arms. And an old farmer in a pickup truck came down the road. And every once in a while, he would slow down and he'd holler, "War's over, you boys can go home." And then when we got back to camp, they said, atomic bomb and all this. And so it wasn't until the Atlanta Journal came out, and we were able to get over to the newspaper that we, read about atomic bomb at Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and some of those things. But
now, when you heard, so you knew about that. I guess what I'm getting at, Bob, is that so when you're on the train, this is after you were at Aberdeen, and you're on the train with the group going to Los Alamos. Yes. Then you knew what Los Alamos was all about.
They didn't tell us where we were going.
I see. You didn't know it at that time.
No.
Oh, okay.
They did not tell us. They said it was a secret base, and they had an important job, and they wanted us to do.
I see. I thought they'd briefed you on that. So
no.
No,
we were going to Los Alamos.
So did the train end up going to Lamy, New Mexico? Sighting outside Santa Fe.
We the car we were on developed a flat wheel. I don't know if you ever heard of flat.
I think I have heard it. Yeah, where it'll get a flat piece on it. Yeah.
So anyway, they pulled us into St. Louis, in the yards at St. Louis, and they switched us around, and we went over to the shop area. And so anyway, Clary and I, we were just hanging out together. Anyway, he hollered out the door, said, how long was it going to take to change this wheel? And they said, a couple of hours. And we could see the railroad station over in the distance. So he and I hopped off the train. We went over to the railroad station. And we had a beer or two, and then walked around a little bit, and then came back. Well, just as we were getting on the train, some officer spotted us. So they chewed us out, and then they put he and I on KP.
Oh, jeez.
St. Louis.
Really? Oh my gosh.
Out to Lamy.
Huh.
And we I don't know what was being shipped up to Los Alamos or what, but our car and one or two freight cars then were on a switch engine from Lamy all the way into Santa Fe. And then we were picked up by a bus and sent up to Los Alamos. And it was a moonlight night, and you could look over the side of the road. Man, you couldn't see nothing but black down in there. And
had you ever seen any terrain like that before?
No, I had never really been west of the Mississippi.
Yeah.
Before that time. But that
it must have looked like it was like on the moon or something.
I enjoyed the mountains out there. In fact, that's still my favorite part of it.
Everybody says that, and I've been out there several times, and they've really, if I had my druthers, I would like to live there sometime. I can understand why so many people decided to stay out there once they got there. Mm-hmm. And so that was, you weren't married at the time at all, were you, Bob?
No.
So what age were you, about 18? I guess you wouldn't, since you just got out of school, yeah.
At that point, I was 19.
Huh. Once you, when was it, I guess, when did it first enter your mind that you were headed to the place where they had developed the atomic bomb?
It wasn't until that when we arrived at Santa Fe.
And how did you first, is that where somebody first told you were going to Los Alamos?
Yeah, the bus driver told us that's where we were going.
Huh. What was your impression?
Well,
Did you care one way or the other,
no,
or it didn't mean that much?
It didn't mean that much to me, no.
Yeah, just
you don't,
just being a young whippersnapper at that time.
it until you experience it.
That's right.
You didn't know what to imagine that it was up there.
When you first, so you got there in the middle of the night?
Yes. The Army always makes sure you get somewhere in the middle. Damned if I know how they figured it out. But they have always done it.
How was the first couple 3 days there? Can you tell me a little bit about what the first? In other words, how did you first get kind of indoctrinated to the area?
Well, not so much to the area, but for our duties.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And they, explained that you were to take the precautions that.
Did they tell you about the security? I mean, was it pretty heavy security and all that?
Yes, we thought so because we had never, had any type of security at the only guard post that we ever pulled was fire guard.
Yeah.
To keep anybody from being trapped in a burning building.
That's right.
Like that. But they had a few posts that were manned around the clock, and they were places where there was radioactive material. One of them was in the tech area, and
is that where the vault was?
No.
Oh,
in the tech area, it was minute amounts, but all these buildings were old temporary Army buildings, and they had experienced a fire in the tech area.
I remember that, or heard about that.
And they were afraid that, any radioactive material, it would be dispersed with the
in a fire. Uh-huh.
So you had minute amounts in these various offices or labs. And
where they were doing tests and so forth, yeah.
If you didn't bother anything, it's just that if there was a fire, you were to remove as much radioactive material as you could.
And how was it kept in these offices?
Well, usually it was in a small amount that they would analyze and check. Some of it was in.
You're talking about like microscopic quantities?
Yes, very
small quantities.
Some of it was in test tubes.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay.
But this was just a laboratory type thing, not a production type. Now the production went on at a place called DP.
I'm familiar with that.
Which stood for D prime, and it was within the barbed wire fences and cyclone fences there.
Yeah, I've got some pictures of the DP sites.
The vault was located.
Oh, that's where the vault was.
Yes.
I see.
The end product at DP, well, the product that was hauled in from Hanford was in the form of a slurry.
Okay, I'm familiar.
Acidic slurry.
I'm familiar with that. Yes.
Stainless steel tubes, and they would haul that in. Then they would dry it out and put it through an electric furnace and form it into hemispheres.
So in other words, they were actually isolating the pure plutonium and putting it into a metal form there.
Yes, well, enriched plutonium.
Yeah.
And then, without leaving the confines of that place, then they could put it in the vault.
Now, as far as, do you know if most of the plutonium at that point in time at DP site that was being made into those hemispheres?
Yes. Now, I did see some of it only on one occasion in the form of a bolt. There were no threads on it, but it was
shaped like a bolt.
Yes, it had a round head on it.
Yeah.
And it was about an inch in diameter, and they called that a bolt. But
any idea what that was used for?
Evidently, that could have been something that might have gone with the gun-type bomb. I don't know. But after that, the only thing we had were the hemispheres.
I was just writing something. Now I know that so the vault was at was at the DP site.
Yes.
Now, I know they were still, of course, you know, the Slotin accident where Cleary was, when they were doing that criticality test, or that tickling the tail of the dragon there. Now, that type of duty that Cleary had there at the desk, was that a typical type of duty for all of the security guards? Would be to man, you know, while experiments were going on of some type, would be to man a desk like that?
Yes, you were always supposed to keep the radioactive material in view.
Oh, really? Okay, I see.
That's why he was in the room.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have just, you know, dropped it off, but that wasn't part of what we did.
So it always had to, in other words, if it was in a room and being worked on, there was supposed to be a security guard in there with it.
Yes.
I see.
Now, the rough castings had to be milled and turned with a lathe to get the exact dimensions that they wanted. Now, we would go to a vault, and then we had to take that rough casting up to the tech area, and they had an area there that they worked on.
That was that C shop, wasn't it?
Down to the exact.
Bob, wasn't that called the C shop? C for Charlie.
That kind of rings a bell.
I think it's C shop is where they did that machining of the of the hemispheres there. Yeah.
And if any operation, you know, went on overnight, well, then somebody had to be there
the whole time.
The whole time.
I see.
And
so I think either you or some.
What we would do when mealtime came, we would just relieve whoever was there, and then we would stay until the next until they were through that day, or until supper time, and then 6 o'clock and 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock were the times that we would be relieved.
Okay, I see. Yeah. I think you had said once before is that when they were machining this plutonium, all of the shavings and everything had to be accounted for, right?
Yes.
And did that end up going back to Hanford?
No, I think that went back to DP.
Went back to DP site for more refining.
Well, they would go back and melt it down and used it in another casting, I imagine.
I think the reason I was asking that, and I'm just interjecting this, Bob, because it seemed like Dick Skanke, whenever it seemed he was mentioning that that a lot of times that they would have some kind of a load that would be going back from Los Alamos to Hanford when they'd go up there. Do you know what?
Well, they had to take
what would be going the other direction?
They had to take those long tubes back up there.
Oh, I see.
To be refilled.
Oh, that's what. I see.
Yeah, they had these black panel trucks.
Yeah.
And they had racks in there for these canisters to go back up there.
Yeah. And they were bolted in place, I think, in those in those trucks.
Yeah, keep them in place.
Yeah. But
rolled over.
Besides the DP site and I think where the Slotin accident was, that was what, Omega Canyon?
No.
Oh no?
No.
What was that?
They called it Omega Laboratory, but we didn't call it that. We just called it Pyrita Canyon.
Oh, okay.
And now the road that goes right by Pyrita is one of the main roads to get up on the hill now. It's much less dangerous than the original road. You don't have the inclines and the curves that you had on the original road, even after they...
I've probably been by there because I've been up and down all those roads.
But we just called it Pyrita Canyon and Omega Canyon. And the fellow that was killed in either 43 or 44 had his accident in Omega Canyon.
That was 45.
Was it 45?
Yeah, because that was Harry Dalian.
It was...
Because, see, my mother was a nurse at the hospital when that happened in August of 45.
Okay.
And then Slotin's was the next year.
They hushed that up. I'd never heard of that until after I got away from Los Alamos.
Oh, really?
I didn't know that anybody had been...
You know, Dick Skanke was telling me when I talked to him, Bob, and I think you verified probably the same thing, is that you were not... It wasn't until after you had left there, or at least pretty late in the game, that you knew how dangerous some of the stuff was that you were handling.
Well, when my hair started falling out, yes. And I...
Is that a true story?
What?
Your hair started falling out?
Yeah.
When?
In early 1947.
Is that right? No, I didn't know that.
I visited my aunt and uncle out on the West Coast near San Diego, and he was a doctor, and I went out there and stayed a couple of days with him because it took a day to go out there and a day to come back. Anyway, he and I were talking about it. Of course, him being a doctor, he knew a little bit about X-rays and some of the harm that could come there. And he was a little bit concerned, but all my aunt could talk about were those ugly army boots. She had at least been concerned about my hair.
Jeez.
And I believe that is the reason. Eventually, they pulled me away from the radioactive material and put me on as a courier between Los Alamos and Sandia, because another staff sergeant and I were assigned the courier duty, and I took it 1 week, and then he took it 1 week, and so that limited my exposure.
Did you wear the radiation badges and everything?
Yeah, we had film badges, but most places they just use nose swabs. But only in an extremely hot area they would have the film badge.
Dick Skanke was telling me that he was. You may have heard this story. I don't know. But he was telling me he was eating. There was an apple in one of the offices, and he was eating the apple, and he thought just as a lark he'd run it by the Geiger counter because it'd been in one of the hot areas. And he said that needle just started going crazy with that damn apple.
Well,
did you ever hear anything like that?
I do know this, that if you had any kind of an open cut, they did not want you in the near radioactive material.
Is that right? Huh?
Yeah. If you had any, any kind of a
open sore or cut or anything. Yeah.
They were afraid that radioactive dust would get in it.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And it might, prove detrimental. So I know.
But did you actually have any fear of that then when you were there? Or?
No, that didn't seem to bother me all that much. My hair was falling out.
Boy, that's something. No, I hadn't heard of that. That's when you was there other sites? Well, what other sites would you? I remember in the early days. When I say early days, I'm talking about in the 43, 44, 45. There was a lot of testing and so forth at the S site. Did any of the security guards go there?
Only when they had a trial assembly. The assembly building was out at S site, and it's an old wooden building. And last time we were there in '95 on reunion, there was some talk about trying to declare that a historical site.
I've got some information on that. That's right. Yeah.
too rotten.
Yeah, it was just a piece of.
Save it.
I know it. Yeah.
So I guess it's been torn down by now.
Huh.
But that's where the they would do a trial.
Yeah.
Assembly. And then they would, take it, label everything, take it on the farm.
Was there any other locations, at least right near Los Alamos, that was also part of the guard duty?
Yes, Bayo Canyon.
What was it?
B-A-J-O.
Huh.
You had to go out the front gate and down the hill a few miles, and then you came to a road that turned very sharp back to the left, and you went back up in that canyon. And that's where they did the explosive charges to see if they were getting the proper amount of compression.
Yeah, in the implosion?
The implosion.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And they would set it up. And then that night, security guards would go down there and guard it all night.
Oh, I see.
And they had a car with a radio. And every half hour, you were supposed to radio back to the office to let them know that everything was okay.
I see.
They put 2 men down there, and they would go down about 6 in the evening and get relieved about 6 in the morning.
Hmm. Well, that was lonely duty.
Well, the coyotes kept me company down there. we were about half asleep one night, and the old coyote sounded out, and I thought the world was coming in here. I never heard a scream like that in my life.
How often did you do that kind of duty?
I did it twice, and I guess every few months they would do that. But when they would set one of those off, you knew about it because it'd shake the ground up there on the hill.
I'd heard that, yeah.
And they had periodic explosions where they would test different batches that they made out of death site. But they were minor explosions. You could hear them, but they didn't rattle the ground. But when they set off one of those, checked for implosion, it was something. They would do that every few months.
How was the security guards? How were they organized? And I'm talking about as far as like a company or a.
It was very loose. You had.
You said there was about 50 men altogether, maybe.
Yes, probably a few more than 50.
Okay.
Because you had a kind of an H-shaped barracks.
Is that the double B and double A?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess you could put 30 men in each one.
Oh, okay, I see.
And some of them were double bunk, but not many. And then they had another duty that was a little bit strange. And I pulled it a couple of times. They would send 2 cars of men down to a rail yard in Albuquerque. And usually there was either 1 or 2 officers that go with you.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a railway express car. One of these cars that had passenger accommodations on one end and an express car on the other end.
Hmm.
Have you ever
seen
anything like that?
No.
And
you mean just a short train?
No, it was just one car.
Oh, I see. One car.
One car, and it was shaped like a passenger train.
Yeah.
And they had some seats in one end and just an open freight area in the other end.
I see. No.
And we get down there a little before dark in the evening, and we had carbines and some submachine guns and a sidearm, and there would be people, guarding it, and they would go out to Sandy or Kirtland somewhere at night, and we'd stay down in that rail yard all night long, and then in the morning, they'd come back, and then we'd go back to the hill. We never knew anything about it.
You mean you never knew what was in the car?
There were 2 things that were discouraged up there at Los Alamos.
Yeah.
One was a camera.
Yeah.
And the other was asking questions.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. What they used to always call need to know, right?
Right. We didn't need to know nothing. And some of the scientists were rather aloof. I mean, they wouldn't acknowledge your presence even. And others were just as nice as they could be. And I remember one cold day, and very few of these labs were outside, out in the boondocks.
Yeah.
They had no heat in most of them, and we delivered a hemisphere, and this fellow said, "Have you ever felt this stuff?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Here." And he handed me a hemisphere. And it was cold that day.
But the hemisphere was warm.
The hemisphere, the molecular motion in that thing warmed it up.
I heard that, yeah.
10 degrees. but it felt warm.
Huh. I think the one thing is that most people, and you've hit on something that's in fact today most people think that plutonium is deadly radioactive, but it really isn't. You know what I'm saying? The process of manufacturing it is highly radioactive, but the end product isn't, which is why you could touch it. And but that's something. I was writing something down too on this express train because I wanted to follow up and ask how many times did you make that trip down to Albuquerque with that sighting?
Well, I did that twice, and put that in your questions to the other men.
That's what I was going to do.
And ask them if they knew what was in the car. I mean,
but was this car sitting by itself, or was it at the end of a train?
Off to itself, and there was nothing else around it, and that's the way they wanted it.
I think Dick Skanke had said sometimes that they transferred some stuff came from Hanford by rail. I wonder if that would have been part of it.
That might have been.
Huh?
That might have been, yeah.
Since
it came to Albuquerque rather than through Lamy. But
yeah, that's strange, isn't it?
I don't know what the destination would have been if it was to be hauled to Los Alamos. Why
would it come there?
We would have had the black panel trucks there to haul it. But it was never, to my knowledge, nothing was ever moved.
Oh, I see. You just guarded it, and people came back the next day, and you left.
Yeah. Ask if anybody knew whether anything was ever put on that car or taken off that car, and what was in it.
Okay, I'll do that. Dick was telling me that he used to they'd make runs to Oklahoma to pick up shipments that were coming from Oak Ridge. That they would meet a similar trucks somewhere in eastern Oklahoma and switch cargo. Did you do any of that, or did you?
No, I never went on a road trip. No.
Just to Sandia.
Yeah, that's all we did that for a few months through spring and summer down there on that courier. I was on that for a long time.
Was that a daily thing?
Yes. They hauled a mail pouch that originated up at Los Alamos,
yeah.
Headquarters building, and you delivered it to headquarters at Sandia.
Oh, I see.
Then then you would go and eat lunch, and you and the driver, he was a civilian from the motor pool, and then we would go back and pick up the locked mail pouch at Sandia headquarters and deliver it to headquarters back at Los Alamos. And one time during the 1947 tests in the Pacific, we went to Albuquerque, and I went in the headquarters to pick up the mail pouch at Sandia, and they said, we're not ready yet. You'll come back in an hour. So we just went outside and sat under a tree at headquarters, and went back in after an hour, and they said, we're still not ready. And I told her we'd been sitting out under a tree, and she said, well, we'll call you, whenever.
Right.
Whenever we're ready. So I think maybe we went someplace and got a Coca-Cola or something and sat under a tree, and it was getting pretty late in the afternoon. And finally she came out, and so I went in the office and to get the mail pouch, and she handed me an envelope, and she said, you are to deliver this personally to General Groves.
Oh, really?
He'll be waiting at headquarters up at Los Alamos. And so I put that in my jacket, and we went on back up there, and the sun had already gone down behind the mountains, and it was getting, I wouldn't say dark, but
yeah.
how it is.
I know how it is up there once that sun goes down. Yeah, yeah.
In the shadow up there. And he was sitting on headquarters steps.
Huh.
My feet no more got on the pavement out of that car. And he said, "Sergeant, do you have a letter for me?" So I gave him my best salute. And
I'll be darned.
And handed him his letter.
Huh.
And that's the only time I ever saw General Groves.
Isn't that funny? That's
And there was a clerk still inside headquarters, waiting for that mailbag.
Really? Yeah.
And I told him, about the letter, and he said they had to decode it. So I think it was during the Pacific test about that time.
It was something.
Some kind of results.
Yeah. He'd been anxiously waiting for or something.
Because when I came out, he was engrossed in that letter, and I didn't bother him anymore.
You didn't ask him what was in it, huh?
I didn't salute him or anything. He probably wouldn't have returned it.
I was going to say, he probably didn't even notice you leaving. Yep. Yeah, he was so. Well, listen, Bob, I'm gonna let you go.
These fellows were always practicing quick draw.
Are you saying quick draw?
Yeah.
Yeah.
See how fast they could outdraw each other.
Oh, really? Okay, now I'm with you. Yeah.
Okay, that was the DP site.
Huh.
One man was on one side of the window and one on the other, and they practiced. And one of them shot the other.
Shot through the glass?
Yep. One man uses the regular draw, and the second man who got shot used the cross draw. And his hand was right about his belt buckle, and the shot came through and hit him in the hand. Otherwise, it had got him right in the belly button.
Jeez. What happened over that?
And Mike Dooley was the one that shot him, and nobody can remember who it was that got shot.
Oh, really?
And it may have been before this last group that came up there in December of 46. It may have been before they came there. But anyway, nobody can remember.
And were these with the 38 pistols that you had?
Yeah, 38 specials.
Huh.
Yeah, we had those on post, and the weapons always stayed in. They probably were hotter than $2 pistols because they stayed in DP all the time.
Oh, I see. In other words, when you left them there.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. All you did was go in there and change clothes, and then when you came out, you changed back into your fatigues. And for a long time, we never wore Class A uniform on duty. And it wasn't until much later that they started insisting that we wear a Class A uniform and wear a SG red and white armband.
Yeah, I've got a couple of those pictures, which you yeah. So that wasn't you didn't wear those armbands all the time, huh?
No.
Huh?
No.
Dick Skanke was telling me about something, and maybe you can. He was saying that one of the things that he used to do, at least one of his duties, would be that after hours in the tech area would be to go around and check to make sure there wasn't any classified material out on desks.
No, I didn't.
They'd have to pick up the paperwork. If they found something that was top secret on a desk, they'd take it to the office.
That was stamped.
Yeah.
But I never had any orders like that when I was up there.
But he said that a lot of the scientific people did not like the security guards because they were always kind of looking,
Yeah.
But you didn't experience any of that?
No, I thought that type of thing was outside our perimeter because our sole responsibility was for the radioactive material. But I may have heard something about that, but I never received it.
You didn't experience it yourself? No. Yeah. Okay. Well, I've got a lot more questions to ask you, but I'm running out of steam.
Okay. Well, good to talk to you.
All righty. It's good to talk to you too, Bob.
All right.
Yeah.
Good night.
Bye-bye.